What is the pettiest thing you've seen someone fired for? I worked in a warehouse and it was absolutely pissing down with rain, like huge rainstorm, thunder, lightning, etc. A colleague of mine would catch the train to work and they weren't running that day because the tracks were flooded, so he'd call a cab. He got the taxi to pull into a service station so he could buy an umbrella for the walk home after work. He arrived 10 minutes late and was fired because the boss said he shouldn't have stopped to get an umbrella.
That's pretty rough. It's wild how something like that could lead to getting fired. You think trying to think ahead and stay dry would be a good move. But some bosses just don't see it that way. Just goes to show how unpredictable work can be, especially in bad weather. You never know what's gonna happen, really.
Not me, but I saw 3 receptionists fired at a doctor's office for some of the silliest reasons. The first one spelled diarrhea incorrectly in the medical notes. The second one used a purple pen instead of blue in the medical notes. The third accidentally filled the coffee pot with decaf instead of regular. All 3 were fired on the spot.
Seems a bit harsh for minor mistakes. I get that accuracy is key in a medical setting, but those reasons feel pretty trivial. It makes you think about workplace culture and how some places might take things too far. I mean, it's just a pen color or a typo. It would be tough to work in an environment where you're always worried about making small mistakes.
Someone was fired for reporting the office manager's blatant favoritism to her relatives. I remember when it was brought up to the owner, he asked all of us about it, and only 3 people were not related to her. After that, the manager found every excuse to write my coworker up. I even tried helping cover up any of her mistakes I saw, but it was too late. A month later, she lost her job. It was an eye-opener. This woman was intelligent and capable. What's worse was it was right before we got our holiday bonuses, and she was a single mom with 2 young kids. She was happy that she was going to be able to buy her kids special gifts for Christmas. She looked so crushed when she came to get her things and leave. She even spent 20 minutes in her car in the parking lot crying her eyes out. A few of my coworkers donated some money from their bonuses to her to help her out with the holidays, and I hear she has a new job. It was just so petty and shitty, I even left the place soon after.
It's tough when workplace politics get so personal. I remember a friend facing something similar. She was good at her job, but favoritism led to her downfall. The way her manager treated her was unfair, especially before the holidays. It was nice that some coworkers stepped in to help her out. It really showed the importance of community in tough times. I left that place too, didn't want to be part of that drama.
Woman worked all day copying documents and stacking them up. Several boxes full. She got them all copied before closing time. The manager came over and looked at the stack of paper, maybe 3 feet high. Then she fired her because they weren't stacked straight. Never mind that she got 2 days of hard work done in a single day. The papers weren't stacked straight. I filled out my temporary time card and asked the manager to sign off. I told her that I would never meet her standards. She needed me badly, but I did not need a nitwit supervising my work.
That's a pretty rough situation. It sounds like she put in a lot of effort and then got hit with something petty. It's frustrating when you work hard and it goes unnoticed or dismissed over small details. I think standing up to a bad manager like that is important. Sometimes you just gotta know your worth and not let someone else's standards drag you down.
When I was 16, I was a supervisor at my A&W. Even though we weren't allowed to, I would always tell the other people working they can eat the food that's supposed to go to the garbage. We had cameras in the back, but whatever. One day, everyone on my shift was fired for eating the food I offered them. They had me on tape waking around giving fries and chicken to people. I was never fired or punished or even talked to, but everyone else lost their job for eating food intended for the garbage offered by their supervisor.
That's an interesting story. It's kind of wild how you managed to keep your job while everyone else got fired. Seems like you were looking out for your coworkers in a way. I guess the company just wanted to make an example out of them. It's funny how things work out sometimes, but definitely a tough situation for those who lost their jobs.
Know a guy who ran dogs for a nuclear plant through a contractor. Paid $24.20 per hour. Guy was the best. Always was on time, always ran it perfectly, always said yes to the call-ins. He had prior experience and education on it. His abilities of being the best in the field got him fired. The owner of the K9 company died, and his son saw him as a threat and terminated him. No joke, nicest guy and smartest in the field, fired for being the nicest and smartest in the field.
It's wild how life can turn like that. This guy was clearly dedicated, putting in the effort and getting things done right. You'd think being the best would be a plus, but it seems the son just saw him as competition. Kind of sad to see someone good lose out because of family drama. Just goes to show that sometimes, merit doesn't mean much if the wrong person is in power.
I got fired once for doing some freelance work outside of my working hours in my own time. My boss found out and tried to charge the company I was doing the freelance work for a fee for using me. They told her they had paid me, as they had. She pulled me in her office a few days after and told me that she could no longer trust me cause clearly I was trying to steal from her by doing freelance work without giving her a fee for being my employer.
That's a rough situation. It's wild how some employers can feel so entitled to your outside work. You're just trying to make extra cash on your own time, right? It's crazy to think she saw it as stealing. You did nothing wrong, but it's easy to see how she could misinterpret it. At least you figured out where you didn't fit. It's better to move on, I guess.
I worked as a hostess for a restaurant for a little around my senior year in high school. The manager was a real piece of something. She called up one of the servers and asked him to swing by Blockbuster and grab something for her before he came into work, then fired him for coming in late. Most of us were pretty young employees, with the exception of a few older career servers. Someone probably should have done something. I left shortly after that because someone was messing with my tips. Hostess would pick up their tips the next day after their shift, and my tips went down from like $60 a night to $15. It was horrible.
Sounds rough. Working in restaurants can be tough, especially with a manager like that. The whole situation with the server getting fired for being late after running an errand is just not cool. It's messed up how you were treated with your tips too. It's a shame people can mess with others like that. Leaving was probably the best choice in a toxic environment like that.
My friend Mike told me he got sacked for slouching. He was working for a call center that provided outsourced staff for other companies. One of their clients was being given a tour and made a comment about that slouching fellow, and 10 minutes later, Mike got called into an office and got let go. Trial period.
That sounds rough for Mike. It's wild how something like slouching can end a job, especially in a call center. You'd think they'd focus more on performance. I guess it shows how little things can lead to big consequences in a trial period. It's a reminder to stay aware of your posture, even if it seems minor. Hope he finds something better.
I witnessed a coworker get fired for filling a cup at the drinking fountain and taking said cup to her desk. Apparently, according to the neurotic boss, who has since been given the axe herself, the drinking fountain was for drinking out of only. Fill your mouth, swallow, and that's it. It is never for filling things up. We have sinks for that nonsense. Yeah, true story. I watched it happen.
That's kind of wild. I can't believe someone would get fired over a drinking fountain. It seems a bit extreme. I mean, filling a cup doesn't seem like a big deal. Guess the boss had some odd rules going on. At least they don't work there anymore. Just shows how some workplaces can be really strict about the smallest things. You wonder how they think these rules are worth enforcing.
My mother was a mechanic at Cawood, a local plastics manufacturer, for over 19 years. She required back surgery not too long ago to help with compressed discs in her back and got rotated to another position within the company. During this role, a small incident occurred requiring my mom to change out a fuse in an electrical box, something she had been doing for the last decade. So she wasn't technically a mechanic anymore. They fired her for breach of protocol or something petty. After 19 years, this same company has a history of firing people before retirement to skip out on paying benefits. TLDR Kwood is scum.
It's wild how companies can just toss people aside after so many years. Your mom put in a lot of time there, and to get fired for something they know she's done countless times is just shady. The whole benefits thing is a real issue too. It's like they don't care about loyalty at all. Just shows that sometimes businesses make profit over people, which sucks.
The 35-year-old owner didn't like the coach because he knew what he was doing and didn't want to fire his staff just because the owner went on a power trip. The owner wanted a puppet, not a coach, so he fired him despite turning a below .500 team into a winning team and reaching the playoffs 3 times and almost winning the Super Bowl once.
It's interesting how some people prioritize control over actual success. This owner had a proven coach who turned things around but let ego dictate his decisions. Sometimes the drive for power blinds people to what really matters, like having a solid team in place. It's a reminder that not everyone values the same things in leadership. It can lead to a lot of wasted potential.
In high school, I worked at a grocery store chain in the Midwest that has a large deli that included a Chinese food department. My friend, who was a straight-A student, Eagle Scout, and all-around great kid, was fired for riding Green Day rocks with his finger on a greasy hood vent before cleaning it. They claimed it was vandalism. And if I remember right, he wasn't fired even that night, but a few days later. It was just weird. That kid went on to be a professor of theology at a major university. Not exactly a person you'd ever expect to be fired from a job. Or a Green Day fan for that matter. Winky face.
That's an interesting story. It's funny how something small can have a big impact on someone's life. Your friend seemed like he had it all, but that little act led to a surprising turn. It's cool to see him end up in a serious role like a theology professor, though. Makes you wonder how many other people have similar stories hidden away. Life can be unpredictable sometimes.
I work for a company that makes $2 billion a year in revenue. One of the top salesmen got fired for taking a bag of potato chips from work. We can get food from the cafeteria and pay it back later whenever. He said he never took it, but they had it on camera. I didn't believe it the first time I heard it, but the cafeteria staff ensured it's true. I've been paranoid about not paying for something ever since.
That's a wild story. It's funny how things can escalate over something so small. I get the whole paranoia thing too. Makes you double-check everything, especially when it comes to food. Just shows how strict some places can be. It's an interesting reminder about not cutting corners, even if it seems harmless.
I was actually fired this summer for something I and many of my coworkers found very petty. I worked at a summer camp as a sailing instructor. One day there was a big gust of wind and my boat capsized with 2 campers. I threw my phone in the safety boat and righted the sailboat. Capsizing happens all the time, especially with younger campers. Really was just a normal capsize. I was then fired for having my phone and putting the children in danger, even though my immediate boss told me good job after it happened.
That sounds really frustrating. It's tough when things like that happen, especially when it feels unwarranted. Being a sailing instructor comes with risks, and capsizing is part of the learning process. Your boss's reaction makes it even weirder. Losing a job over a situation that's common in that environment is pretty rough, especially when you were just trying to handle things. It's just unfortunate.
I worked for Kroger when they started the gas card thing. My manager was being threatened that he wasn't giving out enough cards, so he would scan the card and put it at the bottom of the pile. That way, when someone actually took the card, there would be a couple cents on it. He was fired for theft. I was fired a few weeks later by the new manager because I tried to stop a shoplifter.
Sounds like a rough time there. It's crazy how some managerial pressure can lead to questionable decisions. Your manager took a risky route, and it backfired. Getting fired for trying to do the right thing with the shoplifter just adds to the absurdity. Pretty wild how things can spiral out like that. Just a reminder that not all workplaces have the same values.
I worked at Walmart years ago. I would always get my jobs done. If someone else wouldn't get theirs done, the manager would tell you to help out point one morning after clocking out, and all my work was done. The manager tells me to finish someone else's job who already left. That I said okay, but I have to clock back and he said no, that I can't have overtime. So I refused. A week later, I was fired for going to the bathroom.
That's rough. It's frustrating when you put in the effort and then get called out for things that shouldn't matter. I had a similar situation at an old job. Always hitting deadlines, but one time I took a bit longer on a break and my boss flipped out. Sometimes it feels like they just want to blame someone. Glad you shared this. It's a reminder to stand your ground.
Me and my buddy worked at a ski resort. Our boss was an asshole. One day my buddy gets a call from the police department saying that his mother died. Naturally, he runs out the door, gets in his car, and drives away to handle the situation. I told him I'd cover for him. I told my boss what was going on, and he fired my buddy for leaving early without telling my boss, and I was fired for defending him. Immediately after getting fired, I went to the owner and told him what happened, and he said, "Ha, no you're not." And he gave me and my buddy a job in a way better department. Our buddy got fired because his mom died, and I was fired because I defended him.
That's a tough situation. It's wild how some bosses don't get the bigger picture. Losing a family member is hard enough without work adding to it. It's good that you stood up for your buddy though. Nice to see that the owner recognized that and gave you both a better opportunity. Sometimes, things work out in unexpected ways. It's a reminder of how important support is, especially in tough times.
A guy at my last place got fired for picking up a brochure they hand out at the car dealerships for this company. We worked at the head office for this car company. They were all stacked up in a corridor, and he picked it and took it to his desk, not thinking much more of it. There were loads of leaflets and stuff throughout the building, so it wasn't like these ones were out of place. They then accused him stealing this brochure, and he was fired on the spot. They wouldn't even accept him giving it back, and it had never left the building. I found the whole thing ridiculous at the time.
That sounds pretty wild. It's crazy how something so minor can lead to someone getting fired. I mean, taking a brochure that's just lying around seems harmless. It's like they were just looking for a reason to kick him out. Makes you wonder about the company culture. I would have thought they'd have bigger issues to deal with than a brochure. Some workplaces really prioritize the wrong things.
I worked for a startup that had a big cocktail event for investors and media to celebrate a product launch. All staff below senior management were supposed to attend the party and also act as pseudo-caterers, serving drinks and checking coats, etc., as well as doing product demos and answering technical questions. As a thank you, the next day, all the leftover food and drinks were placed in the break room, including about a dozen bottles of nice wine. One of the executive assistants who worked her ass off putting the party together took half the wine home and was immediately fired. What the hell else were we supposed to do with it? Work drunk?
That sounds pretty rough. It's kind of wild that we had to help cater our own party. And then the whole thing with the leftover wine. Like, what were they expecting us to do? Just let it go to waste? It makes sense she took some home, but I guess they had to make an example out of someone. Just seems a bit extreme for leftover drinks after all that work.
I once got fired from a temp job because I had the utter temerity to call in sick. Twice. Once from food poisoning when I was temping in a hospital, vomit plus diarrhea hospital setting equals bad, but not apparently for temps. And the second when I was seriously ill with pneumonia and couldn't get out of bed. I was really worried with my current job from the two above experiences because I'd been moved into a department whose computers were running programs so old they flickered constantly. And I had several absence seizures. I have photosensitive epilepsy, but this is the first time it's ever affected me at work. I technically don't fall under any anti-disability discrimination practices, but thankfully my work is awesome. They knew about my epilepsy and were suitably concerned when they learned the rubbish computers were making it worse, so they just moved me back to where I was before. Smiley face.
That sounds like a rough experience. It's tough when your health gets in the way at work, especially with something like food poisoning or pneumonia. It's good that your current job understands your situation and took steps to help you out. Not everyone gets that kind of support. Glad to hear they moved you back to a better environment. That must have eased some of your stress.
I worked for a guy who had 2 bookstores in the same city. One store was small with just 2 full-time workers and 3 part-timers. The other one bigger with 20-plus employees. Turns out a part-timer at the small store stole about $1,000 in the past half year, so the boss decides to fire everyone there. The most amazing thing, both full-time workers and a part-timer came back after the boss apologized. If jobs grew on trees, I'm sure they would have told him to fuck off.
That's an interesting situation. It's rare to see people come back after being fired, especially under those circumstances. It shows some loyalty, or maybe just the tough job market. If the boss hadn't messed up, things could have been different for those employees. Sometimes you just have to weigh options, and staying might have seemed better than leaving. It's a reminder of how fragile workplace dynamics can be.
I work at a country club, and recently a guy who was always a very good worker got fired for talking behind a member's back. The kicker was that it wasn't even him. A girl who didn't like him told the manager that. Also, a girl got fired for wearing a lightly colored bra under her dress shirt. I saw it and it just looked white.
That's a rough situation. It's wild how quickly things can escalate over gossip, especially when it's not even true. It's also odd to get fired for something like clothing, especially when it seems pretty innocent. Just goes to show how strict policies can be and how they impact people. Must make the work environment tense for everyone.
So I used to work in landscaping and build sprinkler systems. There was the other half of the company that did the mowing and maintenance, and the crew chief was this really cool guy named Ron. Ron was one of those guys who worked his ass off his whole life without complaint and did an amazing job making yards and commercial properties look good. Well, the GM was this incredibly unlikable man named Marty who, to this day, is still the worst micromanager I've ever encountered. Despite his excellent track record, Ron was fired for accidentally spilling a gas can and, in Marty's words, wasting resources. This was the first time this had ever happened with Ron, so he was completely taken aback. Ron called Marty an asshole, shook all our hands, and left. I still believe that he was jealous of the fact that we all liked Ron and didn't really give Marty a second thought. The best part is that Marty could not find a suitable replacement and called Ron up to offer him his job back. From what I've gathered, Ron said something like, "No, and don't ever call me again," before hanging up.
That's a pretty wild story. It's tough seeing a good guy like Ron get booted over a small mistake, especially when he put in so much effort. Sounds like Marty was more concerned about control than anything else. It's kind of satisfying to hear that Ron stood his ground and didn't go back. Sometimes it's better to be respected outside of a toxic environment than to chase after a job that doesn't appreciate you.
Manager, owner's daughter of a hibachi restaurant instructed me to spot clean a wall with a cloth napkin given to me by her. Owner fired me after he saw me using said cloth napkin when wiping down the wall that had some oil/sauce on it due to the classic flying shrimp toss from the chef's spatula. He fired me on the spot within 3 seconds. I said no problem and walked out. Manager called me back about 15 minutes later asking me to come back. So I said I would, but I required an apology from the owner due to how he handled it. I received no apology, so I didn't come back to work. I went back the next day to get some sushi to go and made sure to ask for a bunch of napkins. I didn't get any because they don't have to go napkin/plasticware, only wooden chopsticks. But it was fun to see the owner's face while I smiled and waved goodbye.
That sounds like a bizarre situation. Getting fired for using a cloth napkin seems a bit over the top. It's good you stood your ground, though. Walking out was probably the right call. The next day with the sushi order was a nice touch. Just having some fun with the situation must have felt good. Sometimes you gotta take the chance to smile and let things go.
I fired someone for being high at work. Everyone knew he was high all the time, and we didn't care because he got shit done and was great to be around. Well, we didn't have a choice in this, really. He looked high, and a customer who seemed really chill sort of jokingly asked if he was. He said yes, and they flip out. I asked him if he was high, hoping he would deny it in front of the customer and brush it off as a bad joke, but the guy admits he was high, etc. At that point, a bunch of customers and other staff knew.
I've seen stuff like this happen. You have a colleague who's great at their job, but then they slip up in front of a customer, and it just goes sideways. It's a weird spot to be in when everyone knows, but you still have to follow the rules. It's tough letting someone go when they're generally good, but sometimes you just can't ignore the image at projects.
Guy I worked with got sent a joke email a few years back. The gif of the naked girl streaking at a football match, kicking the goal. He had no control of receiving it. Was sent by another part of the company unsolicited. He reported by sending it to his boss immediately and was fired for sending and receiving pornographic emails at work. Poor dude. 6 years of hard work gone.
That really sucks. I can't believe he got fired for something he didn't even ask for. It's wild how strict companies can be with stuff like that. He probably thought he was doing the right thing by reporting it. 6 years down the drain just like that. Makes you think twice about what gets sent around in the office. Just unfortunate all around.
Not fired, but almost fired. He got off with 7 days, no pay. A new lady started, and on her first day, without even asking, she proactively cleaned the entire office, and it looked great. Well, the manager came in and said, "This place looks great. I thought it would never look this good, but all it needed was a woman's touch." Well, she went to HR over it because he said the word woman, and she claimed it was sexual harassment and that he made her feel uncomfortable. The main HR lady wanted to throw the frivolous case out, but the project manager said no. So they worked out an agreement, and the guy wasn't fired, but he was given 7 days no pay, which where we worked was a hefty sum of money. And you can't actually ever leave work. You're in a remote area, so you just go back to your living quarters.
That's a pretty wild story. Someone just trying to compliment a job well done ends up getting in trouble. It's funny how things can escalate quickly. I guess the manager should have been more careful with his words. 7 days without pay is a serious hit, especially in a remote setup. Makes you think about how easily misunderstandings can happen in the workplace.
One of my co-workers at a drugstore got fired for eating a granola bar behind the cash register. No warning or anything. Weird thing is I did the same thing every day with no repercussions. I wonder whether they hated him, didn't know I was doing it, or whether they caught him stealing and it was a cover-up. I seriously doubt the latter.
It's funny how things work out. I've had moments where I got away with stuff while others faced the consequences. Makes you think about fairness in workplaces. Sometimes it feels like there's no clear reason behind decisions. I guess it's just the way things go. You never know what's really happening behind the scenes. Just shows how easy it is to get caught up in something random.
I'm responsible for one, actually. Sad face. An operator I had working for me was generally tasked with operating a notoriously finicky piece of equipment. I eventually figured out a set of modifications which made the machine much less temperamental, and therefore much more boring to run. My operator subsequently fell asleep at exactly the wrong moment, and the owner saw it and fired him. That left me running the machine until we could find a new operator. I too fell asleep, but didn't get caught. Still feel pretty bad about that one. He was a good guy. Uneasy face.
That's a pretty tough situation. You tried to help by making things easier, and it backfired a bit. It sucks that your operator got fired, especially when he was just doing his job. Falling asleep must be a common risk in those scenarios. Sometimes, even if you know it's wrong, it can be hard to stay awake in a boring job. Guess you learned a lesson from that though.
I work in an industry where we look after rich and famous and their toys. My friend was fired because her ass was too big. That was what the captain told her, what the boss had said. I will personally vouch that the ass in question was not that big. There have been some great stories over the years. The industry is now full of kids trying to get rich quick, so now, when someone is fired, they are easy to replace.
That's a wild story. Getting fired over something like that seems pretty absurd. I guess it shows how shallow some places can be. The industry's changed a lot, I guess. It sounds like there are a lot of inexperienced people just chasing money rather than focusing on the work. It's tough to see friends go through that. Makes you appreciate the good stories even more.
I used to have a boss who would creep up behind people waiting for them to do something he could fire them for. He fired one guy for having a browser open. Seriously, all our computers were hooked up to the network. The network was hooked up to the internet, but you weren't allowed to use browsers because then you were stealing bandwidth from customers. If you needed the internet, you were supposed to go over to tech support, get one of the tech support people to stop working and let you use their workstations which had modems in them, dial into our own service, and use that to look up / download whatever you needed. Had your brain exploded yet? So yeah, this guy would fire people for having a browser open, for having stuff that was made in Germany, for using the good tea. He threatened to fire me and this girl if we went to lunch together.
That sounds like a nightmare. It reminds me of a job I had where the manager was obsessed with rules. He'd walk around looking for small things to nitpick. I remember one guy got written up just for eating at his desk. It was awkward and stressful. The whole place felt like a prison. People were always on edge, wondering if they would be next. Not a fun environment at all.
Worked at Best Buy. One of the managers there was an amazing lady. We called her Mama Keys because she was basically a mother figure to all of us. Worked there for 7 years, and they fired her for forgetting to lock the inner door at night. Our front door has 2 doors, an outer and an inner one. Between the two is a metal fence barrier, so people have to go through that to even get to the inner door. Absolute bullshit, so many of us were so upset. They were just looking for a reason to get rid of her, and I have no idea what. People have left the back door to the warehouse open, where you can walk in from outside right to where all the unshelved merchandise are with no repercussions.
It's tough when someone who cares gets pushed out over something small. Mama Keys kept everyone together and had our backs. You'd think they'd value that, not toss her aside for a door mishap. The double standard is wild. It's frustrating to see the place make those decisions, especially when real issues are ignored. Losing good people like her makes a job feel less like a team and more like a stepping stone.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.